Today we are beginning the first class of the gastrointestinal system, the gastrointestinal system pathology. That is part of your systemic pathology. We're beginning this. The first lecture in this system is your peptic ulcer disease and the carcinoma, gastric carcinoma. So I've divided my class into two parts. First, we'll be talking about peptic ulcer disease, which is a benign pathology, and then we'll be moving on to discuss the malignant pathology, that is gastric carcinoma, and we'll also see how the two are interlinked. Okay, so before we begin, I would like to walk you through the normal histology and anatomy in very short, just as a quick revision. As you all must be aware, that the alimentary canal, right from the esophagus to the anus, is divided into four functional layers, broadly four functional layers. The innermost layer towards the luminal side is your mucosa, and beneath the mucosa lies the layer called the submucosa, that is beneath the mucosa. Then we have got a thick muscular layer, which is called as the muscularis propria. And then we have got the outermost layer, which is the serosa or the adventitia. So, broadly, the submucosa, the muscularis propria, and the outermost layer, it is roughly almost similar in the different anatomical regions of the gastrointestinal tract. So basically, what is the difference? The difference lies mainly in the organization and structure of the mucosa. Okay, so it is the mucosa that shows histological variations, and we must know how this mucosa varies in the different parts of the gut, which also helps us to recognize the uh, the origin of the biopsies. Like in your pathology, in the pathology practice, we get gastrointestinal biopsies, which comprise of mucosa and only at times part of submucosa. So they are superficial biopsies, and it is the mucosa that helps us to identify the origin of the biopsy. This is a special stain, the Mason trichome stain, which is very beautifully highlighting the different layers of the gastrointestinal canal. Okay, okay. So we proceed further. Here we are looking. Here is just a quick recap of how this mucosa shows histological variation in different parts of the gastrointestinal tract. So, in the esophagus, now this variation is basically for because of the different functions that is performed at those sites. So, for example, in esophagus, we need a protective type of mucosa because it is subjected to a lot of frictional trauma by the swallowing of food. So, we have got a multi-layered, thick, stratified squamous epithelium in the esophagus. When we come to the stomach, here the mucosa is both. It is mainly the secretory type of mucosa, and it is composed of gastric glands. These glands are long, tubular, and branching glands. These branching glands, multiple such glands open into a gastric pit, which in turn opens onto the surface. And why do we have secretory type of mucosa? Because in the stomach, the churning of food takes place and digestion process takes place. So this mucosa is lined by cells, epithelium, which is composed of cells that secrete acid, that secrete digestive enzymes, and also some neuroendocrine cells. Then in the small intestine, the primary function is absorption of nutrients. So we need an absorptive type of mucosa. The absorptive type of mucosa, to maximize the absorption and to increase the surface area, we have these long villi. It's thrown into folds called villi, and in between the villi we have got short crypts as well. And these villi are lined by absorptive columnar cells and also some mucus cells. And in the colon, the primary function is, again, there is little absorption, primarily that of water. Rather, what is required is secretion of mucus for the purpose of lubrication. So we have lots of goblet cells in the colon, and the colonic mucosa does not show villi, rather it shows these long tubular glands, which are called the crypts, right? So, and these crypts are lined by these goblet cells which secrete mucus. So this was in short the histology of the alimentary canal in the different parts, the major type of mucosa histologically. Now we will begin with the pathology of stomach. Before that, in short, I will just tell you about the anatomy. The stomach is divided into cardia, fundus, body, and antrum, four parts, and the antrum terminates into a thick muscular sphincter, which is called the pylorus. So now the mucosa, the gastric mucosa, shows variation even in these different anatomical regions. So the gastric type mucosal glands are found mainly in the fundus and the body region of the stomach, while in the antrum we have primarily the mucus cells, and the gastric glands are not seen. Now, what are these gastric glands? What are they composed of? We will be seeing subsequently. The gastric mucosa is thrown into broad irregular folds which are called the gastric rugae. These are the gastric rugae. These are irregular. They are not really in any particular, they are not arranged in any particular pattern. And what is the role of these rugae? They help in distension of the stomach when the food reaches stomachs. So the food stays in stomach for about 2 hours, and to accommodate the food, the stomach has to undergo distension, and so these mucosal folds, the rugae, they help in this distension. So they flatten out with distension, while the rugae are prominent when the in the non-distended state of stomach. So this is the photograph of resected specimen of stomach, which is showing the gastric rugae. So this is how they appear in a fixed, permanent fixed specimen. And this is the endoscopic view when we see the stomach through the endoscope in a patient. The gastric rugae appear like this. This is the lowest power magnification view of the stomach wall. This is the mucosa. This is what corresponds to the fold of the mucosa, that is the gastric rugae. This is the mucosa. Then we have got the submucosa. It is a loose layer of loose connective tissue that is composed of vessels, lymphatics, and nerves. Then we have got a thick muscularis propria. Now, in the stomach, the muscularis propria is divided into three layers: the inner oblique, middle circular, and outer oblique layer. While in the other parts of the gastrointestinal tract, it is inner circular and outer oblique longitudinal muscle layer. Here we also have an oblique layer. Then we have the serosa. So here we are seeing the two different type of mucosa in the stomach. So this is photomicrograph from the region of the antrum, and we see that these glands, here the mucosa is primarily lined by mucus cells. And this is what I was talking about, the gastric glands. So this is the surface, or the surface that leads into the foveolae or the pits where the gastric glands are opening. And this is the gland. These are long, they form the entire thickness of the mucosa. And we see that the cell composition varies along the length of these glands, right from the surface, foveola, to isthmus, neck, and then the base of the glands. So this is the schematic diagram of a gastric gland. Now, multiple gastric glands can open into one gastric foveolae or pit. So the surface and the pits are mainly lined by the surface mucous cells. Then we have the region of the isthmus, and the predominant cell type in the isthmus is the parietal cell. What is a parietal cell? A parietal cell is it is a polygonal cell that has got abundant eosinophilic cytoplasm, and this is the cell that is primarily responsible for the secretion of acid, the hydrochloric acid, and is responsible for the acidic pH of gastric lumen. We also have the some mucus cells in this region. Then we have the neck region, and the neck region contains primarily the mucous neck cells. Okay. Apart from this, there are some few parietal cells as well as stem cells. So the stem cells of the gastric mucosa reside in the neck region. These are the undifferentiated cells, and they can differentiate into mucus cells and migrate upwards, or they can differentiate into these cells and migrate towards the base of the region. So what are the cells that are lining the base of the gastric glands? We have got, again, we have few parietal cells, but the predominant cell here are these cells. These blue colored cells that you are seeing, these are the sheath cells, also called zymogen cells, also called peptic cells, and these are the cells that are responsible for secretion of digestive enzymes, the pepsin, which is responsible for digestion of proteins into polypeptides. So these cells have got a condensed nucleus towards the base, and they have got a very dense basophilic cytoplasm. So why is the cytoplasm basophilic here? Because it has abundant ribosomes. So we know that the function of this cell is to secrete the digestive enzymes. Digestive enzymes are nothing but protein. Protein synthesis. For protein synthesis to take place, we need the cellular machinery responsible for protein synthesis is ribosomes, and so we have abundant ribosomes in these cells, and so these cells appear blue. So because ribosomes, they take up the basic type, the hematoxylin. Then we also have these neuroendocrine cells, which are shown in the color green here. Okay. So this is the high power photomicrograph. So we are seeing the gastric gland there at different levels. So these are basically cross section of the glands at different levels. This is at the region of the neck and foveolae. This is at the region of this is mainly the foveolae and the pits. This is the region of the neck, isthmus, and this is the region of the base. So here we are seeing a lot of these, many of these, they are blue appearing. So when we see these blue appearing cells, that is it implies that this is the cross section from the base of the gastric glands, and here we are seeing a lot of pink cells, and these are all the parietal cells that secrete acid. So the blue cells are the chief cells that secrete the peptic enzyme, the chief cells are zymogen cells, and the pink cells are the parietal cells that secrete acid. Now, apart from acid, they also secrete a intrinsic factor, which is important in the absorption of vitamin B12, about which you must have read in your lecture on hematology section. So here another high power photomicrograph where we are seeing these large distended cells. These are the parietal cells having abundant eosinophilic cytoplasm. Now we begin with the pathology in stomachs. The most common pathological condition encountered is gastritis. Stated in simple terms, it is inflammation of the gastric mucosa. Now gastritis can be clinically of two forms. You can have acute gastritis and chronic gastritis. Acute gastritis is most commonly caused by consumption of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. It is seen in alcoholics and in patients with severe debilitation. Patients usually present with epigastric pain, nausea, and vomiting, and in severe cases, patient can even have hematemesis, that is blood and vomiting, and melena, blood in stools. Now, chronic gastritis, the most common etiology of chronic gastritis is Helicobacter pylori infection. Helicobacter pylori infection is the predominant cause of chronic gastritis. Apart from this, other causes include autoimmune gastritis, radiation injury, chronic bile reflux. Then, chronic gastritis can also occur in certain systemic diseases like Crohn's disease and graft versus host disease. And typically, patients of chronic gastritis will typically present as nausea and upper abdominal pain. Sometimes patient can even have vomiting. However, hematemesis as the initial presentation is quite uncommon. So this is a chronic persistent form of inflammation of the gastric mucosa. Now, to understand the pathogenesis of gastritis, we need to understand that as we know that gastric pH is quite acidic, it is almost close to 1, and this is a very harsh environment. So, how does the how is the gastric mucosa protected from this harsh environment? We need the acidic pH for the purpose of digestion of food, but we also need to protect our own cells, our own mucosa from this pH. So, how does this happen? So, we have certain protective factors. These are the surface mucus cells. These mucus cells secrete mucus and also bicarbonate ions. So, this mucus forms a thin layer over the surface, and so it prevents, and the bicarbonate ions provide an alkaline pH. It neutralizes the acidic pH, and so the cells are not really exposed to that acidic pH of the lumen. Apart from this, other factors include mucosal blood flow, then the epithelial barrier. So beneath this mucus layer, you have got the epithelial cells, and these epithelial cells also provide a barrier to prevent the back diffusion of the food and the H plus ions into the lamina propria. Then the epithelium, it has great regenerative capacity. The cells are almost renewed every 3 to 7 days. So this also acts as a protective mechanism. Then the elaboration of prostaglandins. It is the prostaglandins which are primarily responsible for all of these protective factors. That is, they are responsible for mucus secretion, bicarbonate secretion. Then, by causing vasodilation, they ensure appropriate proper mucosal blood flow. They are also involved in epithelial restitution. So, prostaglandins play a very important role. So, under normal conditions, the protective factors, they outweigh the damaging factors, which is the acidity and the peptic enzymes, and so the stomach mucosa is protected from any kind of inflammation. Now, when does gastritis occur? When the damaging factors overwhelm the protective responses. And that is what happens in the common etiology. That is what is seen in conditions or in the conditions that result from the common etiological conditions. So we have the Helicobacter pylori infection. Helicobacter pylori, it contains the enzyme, it secretes enzyme urease. Urease breaks down urea into ammonia, and so it inhibits the bicarbonate transporter. So the bicarbonate secretion is affected. Okay, so protective factor is lost. Then non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. The non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, this class of drugs includes what all drugs? We have acetaminophen, we have the ibuprofen. These are the which are very commonly taken for a number of medical conditions. So their primary mechanism of action is inhibition of enzyme cyclooxygenase. And as we have seen, the cyclooxygenase enzyme is very important for the synthesis of prostaglandins from arachidonic acid. So especially prostaglandins E2 and I2. And so when this enzyme is inhibited, the prostaglandins are not formed. And with the loss of prostaglandins, this entire protective machinery falters. And then there is some direct injury also to the gastric cells, which is seen in case of bile reflux, in case of alcohol, etc. Okay, so when gastritis will occur, the damaging forces overwhelm the protective factors. So this I have already told in non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, mechanism is inhibition of enzyme cyclooxygenase that inhibits elaboration of prostaglandins, and so it affects the protective mechanisms. Helicobacter pylori, now Helicobacter pylori it causes predominantly antral gastritis. So when the antrum is affected, there occurs an increased local gastrin production, which this gastrin is a hormone secreted by the G cells, which are the neuroendocrine cells present in the antrum. This gastrin will then act on the parietal cells of the body of the stomach and will lead to increased acid production. Okay, so that is how there is increase in acid production with Helicobacter pylori infection, and then these patients may even progress to develop the complication of food-coating gastritis or Helicobacter pylori gastritis, and that is peptic ulcer disease, to which we will come subsequently. Now, an important point I want to emphasize here is that Helicobacter pylori infection, when persistent, it may progress from the antrum into the body region. It can also extend to involve the body region of the stomach. And when the body or the fundus and the fundus region are involved, then the gastric mucosa undergoes atrophy. Then there is loss of the gastric glands. When there is loss of the glands, there is also loss of the parietal cells. But this loss is patchy. Some of the cells still persist and they can secrete acid, but it is not really significant increase in acid production as is seen when there is intrapredominant gastritis. So in these patients, they undergo atrophy, they develop atrophic gastritis, and then subsequently they undergo intestinal metaplasia, which is a risk factor for development of gastric adenocarcinoma. There is metaplasia followed by dysplasia, and then they undergo the mucosa undergoes carcinogenesis, and patient may develop gastric adenocarcinoma. So Helicobacter pylori is is a carcinogenic agent as well, and there is an inverse relationship. So if there is increased acid production, it will result in formation of duodenal ulcers or gastric ulcers. While if there is a body predominant gastritis, then patient may not develop ulcers, but patient is at risk of developing adenocarcinoma. I will be talking about this in detail subsequently. Now, alcohol, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, they cause direct cellular damage and resulting gastritis. So here we are looking at photomicrograph. This is a special stain, the Warden-Storey silver stain, which is highlighting these organisms, which are nothing but the Helicobacter pylori. These are spiral-shaped bacilli. Now, how does this bacteria survive the acidic gastric environment? So it undergoes adaptation in the ecologic niche. But it has got various virulence factors. So it has got the flagella that allow it to swim through the thick layer of mucus lining the surface. Then it has got the urease enzyme that converts urea to ammonia, and it sort of neutralizes the gastric acid and helps it to survive. Then the surface lipopolysaccharides, we know that our leukocytes have got receptors that recognize these lipopolysaccharides. So this is how it causes inflammation. That is how it causes chronic gastritis. These lipopolysaccharides will adhere to host cell and they will activate those inflammatory cells and will cause inflammation. Then the outer proteins also help. These are called adhesins, and they also help in the bacteria to adhere to the host cells. Then there are some exotoxins like acrylatic toxin. There is also CAG-A, cytotoxin associated gene A. Then it also secretes mucinase, protease, lipases, all of which results in gastric mucosal injury. This is again repetition of what I just told. Now, so basically the outcome of the Helicobacter pylori infection varies. Either patient will, some of the patients, a lesser proportion of patients will develop the complication of peptic ulcer disease out of all the patients who are infected with Helicobacter pylori. So, what determines this persistence of infection or this progression to peptic ulcer disease? It all varies. The variations are because of variations in these virulence factors. Okay, so these virulence factors they vary from one patient to another. Helicobacter pylori in one patient to another. Apart from this, there are also certain host factors to determine the outcome of Helicobacter pylori infection. So, host factors like genetic polymorphisms. So, there are genetic polymorphisms that lead to increased expression of pro-inflammatory cytokines like human necrosis factor and interleukin 1 beta, or they result in decreased expression of anti-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin 10. So, these kind of polymorphisms basically they will result in increase in inflammation, and so there is increased propensity for these patients to develop chronic gastritis. So this is how we can explain that why not all patients who are infected with Helicobacter pylori end up in getting the disease chronic gastritis. This is so host factors are also involved. Okay. So basically the outcome of Helicobacter pylori gastritis is determined by a very close interplay between these three factors: the gastroduodenal mucosal responses, host immune responses, and bacterial virulence factors. Some patients develop only chronic gastritis while others will progress to peptic ulcer disease. Okay, so this is an interplay between these different factors. Now we come to peptic ulcer disease, which is the complication of chronic gastritis. This is chronic mucosal ulceration affecting either the duodenum or the stomach, and it is a complication of chronic gastritis, especially or essentially Helicobacter pylori gastritis. Apart from this, other common associations include non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, cigarette smoking. These are the common ones, these three. Now, a good news is that the prevalence of Helicobacter pylori infection is declining. So the incidence of peptic ulcer disease is actually reducing. However, there has been an increase in use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs in patients above 60 years of age group. And so in this particular age group, the change in the disease epidemiology is there is an increasing incidence. And if these patients also develop Helicobacter pylori infection, then this has a synergistic effect on the gastric injury. Amongst the risk factors of peptic ulcer disease, apart from Helicobacter pylori infection, again, chronic smokers, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, use of drugs like cocaine that reduce the mucosal blood flow, again predisposes the patient to develop peptic ulcer disease. Alcoholic cirrhosis primarily results in duodenal peptic ulcer disease. Then stress by increasing gastric acid secretion also is a risk factor for peptic ulcer disease. Endocrine cell hyperplasia can stimulate parietal cell growth and increase acid secretion and result in peptic ulcer disease. Zollinger-Ellison syndrome is also a risk factor, again by similar mechanism. And then we have certain viral infections can also result in development of peptic ulcer disease. Patients typically complain of epigastric burning or aching pain, which it usually occurs 1 to 3 hours after the meals during the day, and then it gets worse at night, and it is relieved by intake of food or alcohol. Then usually patients have nausea, vomiting, bloating, belching, and even at times significant weight loss. These are some additional manifestations. If the ulcers are quite deep, they are penetrating ulcers, then the pain can be is usually referred to the back, and even in the left upper quadrant or even to the chest. And sometimes this chest pain mimics the pain of cardiac origin. Some atypical presentation of peptic ulcer disease can even be as iron deficiency anemia, or if these ulcers can even bleed, so there can be hemorrhage, hematemesis, or perforation. Perforation can also develop as a complication, though it is very rare, especially in the present scenario. So, what are the endoscopic findings of peptic ulcer disease? So, in a duodenal ulcer, most frequently these ulcers are found in the proximal part of the duodenum within a few centimeters of the pyloric valve. Okay, so because of the acidic contents, highly acidic contents that are reaching that part of the duodenum. And gastric ulcers are predominantly located along the lesser curvature near the interface of the body and the antrum. And this is how an ulcer looks on endoscopy. So here we see this is the what is an ulcer? Ulcer is basically a breach in the lining epithelium, a breach in the mucosa. So this is how a healthy mucosa would look. It appears reddish, and here there is complete loss of this mucosa. Rather, what we see is sort of a slough or a debris at the base, and this is what is an ulcer. Deep extension of these ulcers is usually limited by the thick muscularis layer, also by the adherent pancreas, omental fat, and liver. And perforation, though very rare, can occur, and then it constitutes a surgical emergency. Now we come to the pathological findings, the gross pathology. Okay, so grossly, the peptic ulcers, they are sharply punched out defects. That is, we see that the border or the margin of the ulcer is quite regular. It is not shaggy or it is not irregular. It is a regular outline and it is sharply punched out. That is, there is a very sharp demarcation between the normal mucosa and the ulcerated mucosa. Usually these ulcers occur singly, they are single in 80% of the cases. Also, this margin, it is usually level with the surrounding mucosa. That is, they are at the same level. And this ulcer has got a proximal end and a distal end. Okay, now proximally this mucosa slightly overhangs the base, while distally it is kind of a little slow. I'll tell it in more detail subsequently. Now, depth of these ulcers, they're not generally very deep. It is limited by the muscularis layer, and it generally correlates with the diameter of the ulcer. And base of the ulcer is smooth and clean, and it is why is it so? Because generally all the necrotic material, it undergoes digestion by the digestive enzymes that are being secreted. Okay, so the ulcer base is not very dirty; it appears smooth and clean, and very thin layer of necrotic debris is seen, or it may not be seen at all. It may be inconspicuous or absent. Okay, then this is a schematic diagram to show you the various layers in the ulcer base. So on microscopy, the first layer that we encounter at the base is that of the necrotic debris, which is usually a thin layer, or at times it is not seen, as I just told. Beneath that is the layer of inflammatory cells. Okay, so thin layer of fibrin with a predominantly neutrophilic inflammatory infiltrate, and this layer again is seen if the ulcer is active. Otherwise, this may also be quite inconspicuous if it is a long-standing ulcer and it is not active. Active inflammation is not. There is no active inflammation going on per se. Rather, we will see prominent signs of healing, that is granulation tissue and fibrosis. The third layer is that of granulation tissue that is composed of immature leaky blood vessels, mononuclear leukocytes, and then the fourth layer is that of fibrosis, the collagenous scar that forms the ulcer base. Now, sometimes large vessels within the scarred area, these vessels are thickened and we may find thrombosed vessels. And sometimes these vessels can even bleed, and then it may result in hemorrhage. And that is how we see these ulcers complicating as hemorrhage and presenting as hematemesis or melanoma. Now, scarring may involve entire thickness of the wall, and sometimes what happens is when the ulcer when it has been a long-standing ulcer and it has been undergoing the process of healing, inflammation, and alternatively inflammation and healing for a long period of time, so the entire wall thickness undergoes fibrosis. So when this happens, the mucosal folds, they are all drawn at the center of the ulcer. So how it will appear is the folds are radiating out from the ulcer. So this is the photograph. Here we have the ulcer and we see all these folds are sort of radiating out. So they are basically reaching up to the margin of the ulcer, these you get, because here at the base there has been a lot of scarring, and so these folds are drawn, because when fibrosis occurs, contraction takes place. So because of that contraction, all the folds are sort of pulled into at the center, and it appears as if they are radiating out. Okay. Now, this is what I was telling you about the overhanging mucosa. So this is what is your ulcer. This is the ulcer base. Here we have the layer of necrotic debris. Necrotic debris is very just, very less, very inconspicuous. This blue one is actually the layer of the inflammatory cells. Then we have got here some vessels. These are the vessels and the variable size leaky blood vessels of the granulation tissue. Fibrosis is not really seen much in this photograph. And this is the overhanging the mucosa and at the proximal end of the ulcer, while distally we don't see this overhanging mucosa. Okay. Now, what can be the complications of peptic ulcer disease? As I just mentioned, these ulcers can bleed. So the most frequent complication is that of bleeding, which is seen in 50 to 20% of the cases. and is responsible for 25% of ulcer-related deaths. So amongst the patients who die of peptic ulcer disease, one-fourth of them actually have bleeding or hemorrhage as the cause. That is, it can be such massive blood loss that patient ultimately succumb to it. Then tissue necrosis, how does this occur? Tissue necrosis may extend deeply enough to involve the wall of a large artery. So when the ulcer is active, it keeps on undermining the layers of the stomach, and finally, whenever a large artery gets affected by the inflammatory process and it undergoes and is damaged, then there can be potential bleeding. Most commonly, it is most commonly seen in long-standing chronic gastric ulcers on the posterior wall in the region of left gastroepithelial artery. So this is the artery that is most commonly the culprit or the artery that is most commonly implicated in this bleeding or hemorrhage. Vessels become incorporated in fibrous scar in the serosal aspect and may be eroded during a subsequent acute exacerbation of ulceration, producing torrential hemorrhage, and this may even be the first presentation of ulcer. So patient may not be knowing that he's suffering from peptic ulcer disease. His symptoms may be really non-specific. The patient may be ignorant of those symptoms, and then one fine day, when the ulcer has been present for a long period of time and undergoes this complication of bleeding, then the patient presents directly as hemorrhage, and that is the first presentation. Okay. Then perforation. Now, if tissue destruction outstrips attempts to confine or repair it, then the process will extend rapidly through the wall, and ultimately the entire wall is ulcerated or the portion of the wall is lost, and then it undergoes perforation. And 5% of the patients can show this complication, and two-thirds of the ulcer-related deaths occur because of the perforation. However, usually the patients are diagnosed cases. It is rarely the first presentation as of an ulcer. Obstruction is seen in 2% of the patients. So persistent attempts at repair lead to progressive fibrous scarring, which undergo shrinkage and ultimately cause distortion and thickening of the wall. So as the process of fibrosis keeps continuing, and if the wall keeps shrinking and the lumen keeps narrowing and narrowing, so and at one point of time it's narrowed to such an extent that there is almost a stricture formation, and there is partial or complete obstruction of the lumen, and then the the luminal contents cannot pass beyond that constriction, and then it results. This is what is called obstruction. Obstruction may be compounded by inflammatory edema of the surrounding mucosa in an active ulcer. Now, most often this is seen it is associated with pyloric channel ulcer, because the pylorus is already a narrowed portion of the stomach. So, if the ulcer occurs there, it rapidly progresses to develop obstruction. And how does patient present? Usually, there is the obstruction causes incapacitating crampy abdominal pain because of rigorous attempts to propel the food forward, and rarely cause total obstruction. Intractable vomiting can also occur. Okay, so with this we end the topic of peptic ulcer disease. I'll be starting the second part of the lecture, gastric carcinoma. I'll be taking the doubts at the end. So I'll just continue. Now, gastric cancer is the third most common cause of cancer-related mortality worldwide, and the most common histological type of gastric carcinoma is adenocarcinoma. And I'll be confining my discussion only to adenocarcinoma, with a little mention of gastric lymphomas while we discuss about H. pylori as the carcinogenic agent. Adenocarcinomas are responsible for 90% of all gastric cancers. Now, morphologically, gastric adenocarcinomas can be of intestinal type or diffuse type. And you'll understand this in detail subsequently. What do we mean by intestinal type and what do we mean by diffuse type of gastric cancer? Now, the early symptoms of gastric adenocarcinoma very much resemble the symptoms that are seen in chronic gastritis and peptic ulcer disease that we just discussed in the first half of the talk. So the symptoms are quite non-specific sometimes, and patients are ignorant of the symptoms. And so gastric adenocarcinomas often come to the notice when the disease has really progressed to advanced stages. So a patient will have non-specific symptoms similar to those seen in peptic ulcer disease, dyspepsia, dysphagia, and nausea. And so they are often discovered at advanced stages when symptoms such as weight loss, anorexia, and early satiety, anemia, and hemorrhage appear. Now, incidence of gastric carcinoma, it varies markedly with the geography. So, gastric carcinoma is one malignancy where you will see significant difference in the incidence in the different geographical regions of the world. So there are certain regions where the incidence is very, very high, like Japan, Chile, Costa Rica. where the incidence is 20 times higher than that seen in some other parts of the world. However, the incidence is now showing a declining trend. Also, it's important to note that this declining trend is seen mainly in the intestinal type of gastric cancer, but not in the diffuse type of gastric cancer. So it was the intestinal type of gastric cancer which is most common in these regions of high incidence. And with the decline in the incidence of intestinal type of gastric cancers, now both intestinal and diffuse type of cancers are seen with a similar incidence in many regions. Gastric cancer is more common in lower socioeconomic groups, individuals with multifocal mucosal atrophy and intestinal metaplasia. Peptic ulcer disease is associated with a reduced risk of gastric cancer. Okay, so that is what I was telling you, the inverse relationship. But patients who have had partial gastrectomies, they may have a slightly higher risk of developing cancer in the residual gastric stump, possibly because of hypochlorhydria and also because of bile reflux. Now we come to the etiology. Gastric cancer is a multifactorial disease. While 90% of the cases of cancers occur sporadically, we also have 10% of the cancers that occur in familial or hereditary setting. Okay, and it is these cancers that have helped us to understand the pathogenesis of gastric carcinomas. The agents that have shown sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity include Helicobacter pylori infection, rubber manufacturing, people working in rubber manufacturing industry, then tobacco smoking, exposure to X-rays and gamma rays. And these are the agents that show a limited evidence of carcinogenicity. This includes asbestos, Epstein-Barr virus, some lead compounds, exposure to nitrates, nitrates or nitrites, then some pickled vegetables, salted fish, and processed meat consumption. So beside the coming to the clinical features, the site of gastric carcinoma, that is in the stomach, which is the most common site. So this again varies geographically. In the regions where the incidence of gastric cancer is high, usually the malignancy, the adenocarcinomas are located distally, that is the body antrum and pylorus, and it is the antrum which is the most common site. Now, in regions with a lower incidence, it is usually seen in the cardia or the fundus, that is, they occur proximally. In Japan, the incidence of proximal gastric cancer is also now increasing. Again, as I told, the incidence of intestinal type is declining, and so now even the proximal gastric cancers are seen because the incidence of diffuse type is not decreasing. Lesser curvature is involved more often than the greater curvature. In early cancers, usually patient can remain asymptomatic, while in advanced cancers, patient will have symptoms of dysphagia, vomiting, indigestion, weight loss, early satisfaction of appetite, and anemia. Metastases are often present at the time of diagnosis. As I just told you that these cancers often present at advanced stages, so patient has already developed metastasis. And the common sites of metastasis include supraclavicular lymph nodes, periumbilical lymph nodes, then it can metastasize to ovaries where it is called Flukenberg tumor, especially the diffuse type of gastric cancers. Then left axillary lymph node is also a common site of metastasis and also in the Arjun Douglas. So the differences in the epidemiology of intestinal type and diffuse type of gastric cancers, it is the incidence of intestinal type that varies between the countries, and in the regions of high incidence we have the intestinal type, and diffuse type the incidence is uniform across the countries. Now there has been a change or a decline in incidence of intestinal type, so the incidence of both or types of gastric cancers is now almost equal. Then the precursor lesions are seen in intestinal type, that is flat dysplasia and adenoma, while the precursor lesions have not been identified in the diffuse type of gastric cancers, and sex predilection is seen in intestinal type, where it is twice more common in males than in the females. So, as I was telling you, it is the studies done on familial gastric cancers that have helped us to understand the pathogenesis and the genes implicated. So, when the gastric cancers occur in the familial setting, what we see is that there is germline mutation in the CDH1 gene. CDH1 gene is a tumor suppressor gene. So, the loss of function of this gene will promote carcinogenesis, as you know from your reading of the topic of neoplasia. So, this tumor suppressor gene CDH1 actually encodes for a cell addition protein E-cadherin. So, there is loss of E-cadherin, and with the loss of this cell addition protein, the addition between the cells is lost, and then the cells will infiltrate. They will grow in a diffuse pattern, and then they will freely infiltrate through the wall of the stomach. Familial edematous polyposis patients also develop gastric cancer in the familial setting, and they have germline APC mutations, that is adenomatous polyposis coli gene. This is again a tumor suppressor gene, and with these mutations, there is increased risk of intestinal type of gastric cancers, similar to that seen in colon. Now, sporadic type of gastric cancers and the diffuse cancers, again, 50%, in 50% of the cases, we see mutations in CDH1 gene, similar to that seen in familial setting. And in the remaining cases also, there is loss of function of this gene, not by mutation, but this gene is silenced. It is silenced. How? By hypermethylation of the promoter region. So the gene is present, but the expression of the gene is inhibited. And so the end result is loss of E-cadherin, loss of cell addition, and single cell infiltration of the cells. Now, intestinal type gastric cancers occurring sporadically show mutations in the various components of the Wnt pathway. So there is increased signaling via the Wnt pathway. So there can be again loss of function mutation in the APC tumor suppressor genes, similar to that seen in the FAP patients. Then there can be gain of function mutations in gene encoding for beta catenin. And the other genes that are implicated are TGF beta receptor 2, BAX, which is involved in regulation of apoptosis, and CDKN2A, which is involved in cell cycle control. Okay. Now we come to a very important part, what is the role of H. pylori? The role of H. pylori in gastric carcinogenesis. Now, H. pylori is the first bacterium that was classified as a carcinogen, and it has been implicated in the genesis of not only the gastric adenocarcinomas, but also gastric lymphomas. And what are the sequence of events that ultimately terminate in development of cancer in the patients who are infected with Helicobacter pylori? It is the persistent chronic inflammation, which provides a very fertile milieu for dysplasia to take place. So when there is chronic gastritis, there is loss of gastric gland, the epithelium undergoes atrophy, and it is replaced by intestinal type of epithelium, which is called intestinal metaplasia. That is, the metaplasia is conversion of or transformation of one differentiated mature epithelium into another. So the gastric epithelium is replaced by intestinal epithelium. Once this happens, it becomes further mutations, dysplasia occurs, and then subsequently cancer. Now, this sequence of events takes almost decades to complete, and it occurs in only 3% of the infected patients. H. pylori infection how does it, what are the molecular mechanisms? Basically, the pathogenicity island tag A gene is responsible for which penetrates the epithelial cells, and then inside these epithelial cells, it initiates the signaling cascade that ultimately result in unregulated proliferation of the cells, and that is what we call as neoplasia or cancer. Then the chronic inflammation, the chronic inflammation results in increased accumulation of reactive oxygen species, which is secreted by these inflammatory cells. And these reactive oxygen species, as we know, are genotoxic and can result in mutations in these cells. Now, as an off note, I will just mention briefly how H. pylori infection can even result in gastric lymphomas. Helicobacter pylori infection will result in development of H. pylori reactive T cells. Then these T cells, via activation of nuclear factor kappa B pathway, will cause polyclonal proliferation B cells. That is, there is increased proliferation B cells, but to start with, they are polyclonal. Subsequently, when infection continues and more mutations take place, this polyclonal proliferation is converted into monoclonal proliferation, and then there occurs constitutive activation of nuclear factor kappa B pathway, and patient develops gastric lymphoma B cell origin. Now we come to pathology of gastric cancers. Now, when we look at the gross image of specimen that has been dissected for gastric carcinoma, the gross morphology is different for intestinal type and diffuse type gastric cancers. The intestinal type of gastric cancers usually form bulky exophytic masses. They protrude above the surface, while the diffuse type of gastric cancers, they can present as ulcers. It is actually variable. Even the intestinal type of gastric cancers can present as ulcers. Not necessarily. The diffuse type will present as a diffuse infiltration of the wall. So intestinal type of gastric cancers can either form a exophytic mass, or they can form an ulcer-infiltrative growth. While the diffuse type of gastric cancers, they usually do not produce an obvious growth. Rather, there is single cell infiltration of the wall of the stomach, which results in thickening of the wall, and there is flattening of the rugae, and the stomach is entirely converted into it acquires a leather bottle appearance, and hence it is called as linitis plastica, because of the dense dysplastic reaction which is incited by the host stroma in response to those infiltrating cells. Okay, so in diffuse type, there is infiltrative growth pattern that evokes a dysplastic reaction, and it stiffens the gastric wall, and there is flattening of the gastric rugae, thickening of the wall, and leather bottle appearance termed linitis plastica. Okay. This is the gastric ulcer, malignant gastric ulcer. That is, this is a malignancy that is presenting as an ulcer, and this is an exophytic mass. Coming to the microscopy, in the intestinal type of gastric cancers, these tumor cells, they sort of form these glands. So we see glandular structures in intestinal type. And these gland cells can contain apical mucin, and the lumen of the glands shows abundant mucin. Apart from this, other patterns include the tubular pattern, where we have these tubular glands. Then we also have papillary pattern. Then there can be mucinous adenocarcinomas as well, where a lot of extracellular mucin is being secreted. But in diffuse type of gastric cancer, usually these cells, they do not form glands. They are all arranged singly in the form of sheets. That is, all the cells are just scattered as sheets. They're not forming any pattern. They're not forming any glands. Small clusters may be seen, but they are not more than 2 to 3 cells thick. And why does this occur? Because of the loss of the cell adhesion protein E cadherin. Okay, as I told you in the part on pathogenesis, there's loss of function mutation of CDH1 gene. There is loss of E cadherin protein. There is loss of addition of the cells. The cells are not able to adhere to each other. Rather, there is loss of addition, and so they infiltrate singly. They do not form glands. Instead, they contain large mucin vacuole that completely distends the mucosa. This is one cell. This is one neoplastic cell, which where the what you see is entirely this kind of a hazy, clear to hazy appearance, because this is all mucin which is distending the cytoplasm, so much so that the nucleus of the cell is pushed to the periphery. And this is what is called as signet ring morphology. So these are your signet rings. Here again, you see this very thin elongated nucleus at the periphery, very thin nucleus at one end, and the rest of the cell is all filled with mucus, filled with mucin. It may be mistaken for inflammatory cells at low magnification, so we really have to go to higher power to confirm that this is actually signet ring cells, and so this is a diffuse type of gastric adenocarcinoma. Now, these are photomicrographs which are showing your lymph vascular invasion. These are lymphatics which with their lumen showing these highly pleomorphic tumor cells. And these are the vessels. Here we see the tumor cells which are forming glands, and disease is present within the lumen of the blood vessel. So this release of extracellular mucin can be seen in either type of gastric cancer. It can result in formation of large mucin lakes that can dissect tissue planes. Now, how do we grade gastric adenocarcinomas? We follow a two-tier system, low grade and high grade. Now, low grade and whatever adenocarcinomas were previously classified as well and moderately differentiated are now grouped together and called low grade adenocarcinomas, while those that were classified as poorly differentiated are now called high grade adenocarcinomas. Well differentiated, if the differentiation is based on the extent of glandular differentiation, the extent to which tissue glands. So when we have well-formed glands, we call it well-differentiated adenocarcinoma. When we have poorly formed glands and more of solid areas or single-cell infiltration pattern, then we call it poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma. And the grading primarily applies to tubular and papillary adenocarcinoma. Prognostic factors are the depth of invasion and the extent of nodal and distal metastasis. For early gastric cancer, sufficient surgery is the preferred treatment and may just be sufficient. And with early detection, the complete response can be achieved with surgery. 5-year survival rate can exceed 90%, even if lymph node metastases are present. And depending on the extent of involvement, depending on the stage, subsequently chemoradiotherapy may be given. However, we know that most of the cancers present at advanced stages when they have already invaded into the duodenum, pancreas, and retroperitoneum, and so in that clinical scenario, chemotherapy or radiation therapy along with palliative care are the main management strategies, and 5-year survival rate is also very poor. It is less than 20%. So with this, I complete the topic of gastric adenocarcinoma. And now I would like to tell you the differences between benign and malignant gastric ulcer, which is an important question for you as well. So the benign gastric ulcer, that is the ulcers that are seen in the setting of peptic ulcer disease, are most commonly seen along the lesser curvature, while the malignant gastric ulcers are seen mostly along the greater curvature. But again, this is not a rule, and you may find malignant ulcers occurring even on the lesser curvature. Size, the benign ones are generally small in size, malignant ones are usually large in size, but sometimes the long-standing peptic ulcer, gastric ulcer can even be quite big. But the benign gastric ulcers, they are usually round to oval in shape and they have regular margins, while malignant ulcers are quite irregular. The margins of benign ulcers are smooth, they are level with the surrounding mucosa, and only proximally they show little overhanging. While in the malignant ulcer, the margins are all heaved up. So this is what we call as a heaved up margins. Okay, so there is a lot of heaping of margin. They are not at the same level as the surrounding mucosa, and here we see. So basically, these gastric rugae, they are not reaching up to the margin of the ulcer. There is an intervening zone of the desmoplastic reaction. So here we do not see the gastric rugae. So they stop short of the margins. While in benign ulcers, we see the gastric rugae reaching till the margin of the gastric ulcer. Okay. Cerebral cells extend to the margin of the ulcer in benign gastric ulcers, while they do not reach the margin due to the dense dysplasia surrounding the ulcer margins in malignant ulcers. Then benign ulcers are they are sharply punched out defects, while in malignant ulcers we see a lot of undermining. There is a lot of undermining of the edges, which is not a sharply punched out defects. The edges are all everted. The benign ulcers are not very deep; they are generally limited by the muscle layer. The malignant ulcers can be deep when cells infiltrate. At advanced stages, the cells really infiltrate into the deeper layers, and the ulcers can go quite deep. The floor is smooth and clean, and because it has digested the necrotic debris and slough, it gets digested by the peptic enzymes. In malignant gastric ulcers, the floor of the ulcer is very dirty, shaggy, it is covered with necrotic slough, all the dying neoplastic cells and the apoptotic cells at the center, where the blood supply is compromised. Then at the base of the ulcer, we see the scar tissue, formation of scar tissue because of the ongoing process of healing. Okay, and here in malignant ulcers, we see desmoplasia surrounding the ulcers. Okay, so this I have already explained you. These are this is how benign ulcer looks. This is how a malignant ulcer appears. And with this, we end today's topic of peptic ulcer disease and gastric adenocarcinoma.